Did you know Octane has a free version for Blender? Maybe you did, but do you know whether you should use Cycles or Octane and what the advantages of each render engine are? Well, that's what we're going to find out in this video. Before we get into the side-by-side comparisons, I will provide the details about the license and installation of the free Octane version. In order to get the free version of Octane, you have to go to Otoy's website, create an account and download the free tier version from Octane's product page. Even though you can find it under trial, you can use the free tier for an unlimited amount of time and also have permission to use it commercially. Your only limitations are that you can't use more than one GPU to render and require an active internet connection. Network rendering is also unavailable in the free tier. I assume they chose these limitations, so studios would still prefer to pay for the full version, as most individual creators won't be affected by them. And I personally very much welcome this. The Blender Octane edition is usually distributed as a custom Blender fork, but they also have an add-on version for Blender in public beta. Currently, you can find download links for the add-on version on Otoy's forum. In my opinion, the add-on version is more comfortable to install and maintain, but their custom Blender version is the stable release. But to be fair, they are still working on refining the add-on version, which is why it is still in beta. Both versions require the installation of the Octane server, which is used for authorizing your license. And running it is required for rendering with Octane. This is due to Blender's GPL license. Every code using Blender's API has to be open source. But Octane also has multiple paid plans, and making their engine open source would most likely result in a decrease of sales. So as a workaround, they use a Blender add-on and a separate executable to split their open source and closed source code. This is also the reason why they offer Octane as a custom Blender version. Their Blender version is already configured to better integrate the license server. The custom Blender version should be installed as Blender Octane Edition, so by launching it, you should be able to select Octane in the render settings. If it doesn't show up, make sure the Octane add-on is enabled in the user preferences. I will start by going over the advantages of Cycles, as they turned out being a lot easier to understand. Considering that I will jump between both render engines a lot, the logo of the current render engine will be displayed on screen. Since Cycles doesn't have an official dedicated logo, I designed one myself. The most obvious advantage of Cycles is the integration of it, which you will notice in a lot of different areas inside Blender. Especially the integration of Eevee as a quick preview for Cycles materials sticks out. Both Cycles and Eevee use the same nodes, which provides a seamless transition between both render engines. And Blender's UI is built upon this integration, which makes a lot of sense, considering Blender's UI has been restructured in the same update that brought us Eevee. After all, you can't spell Blender without Cycles integration of Eevee. Whereas switching to the Octane render engine will just hide the icon for look depth shading. If you're using a lot of add-ons or asset libraries in Blender, there is a high chance of their contents being made Cycles ready. So they will by default work in Cycles, but not in Octane. This also applies to Blender's physics simulations. Octane has a built-in converter for Cycles materials, but it is only really reliable when your scene consists out of simple PBR texture materials. However, it does try to also convert more complex materials. As Octane also changes Blender's UI, you can tell and feel that it is a third-party product. I am convinced the developers did a great job of integrating it into Blender's UI, but it still feels somewhat clunky. I definitely understand their struggle though. I mean, imagine you wrote an essay and put a lot of effort into its structure, but now you have to structure it into multiple categories someone else made up. Just like in that example, Otoy had to make their existing product fit into Blender's UI. So keeping that in mind, I have huge respect for how they did it. However, I still sometimes get lost in the UI when looking for something specific. You can also feel differences in the integration when live rendering in the viewport. Cycles is a bit faster in rendering, but that isn't my concern here. What could really disturb your workflow is that the live rendering sometimes doesn't receive updates about the scene as quickly. Like when you move an object around, you can feel a noticeable delay. Also, features like render region can give irritating artifacts in the viewport. Also, since Octane relies on its custom fork, you can't use experimental versions of Blender with Octane. So a lot of the limitations of Octane are a result of how it is integrated into Blender. Octane has pretty much all the features you can expect from a render engine. This, of course, is an advantage, but it also makes Octane more cluttered than Cycles. Let's start with the essentials. In Octane, you can configure different render kernels. You can think of them like different rendering modes. They all come with different features and different settings, but fundamentally, you will want to use them depending on the task. For quick previews, you will want to use the direct lighting kernel, as it renders the fastest, but it doesn't have full global illumination, so your objects won't pick up much color from nearby objects. The closest to Cycles is the path tracing kernel. It just allows more bounces than Cycles by default. This is the kernel you will use for most final renders. But if you want caustics, you can either use the photon or PMC kernel. Render engines that cast photons are known to be better at rendering caustics, because a traditional path tracer renders an image by calculating rays that start from the camera. And to get a caustic, one of those random rays from the camera would have to hit a diffuse surface where the ray again bounces into a random direction. This ray would then need to hit a reflective or refractive surface like a glass or a mirror where it bounces into a determined direction. If this ray then lands on the light source, you will get a caustic. To our disadvantage, the cool looking caustics are usually caused by small light sources, which makes it even harder for the path tracer to get a caustic ray. Photons, on the other hand, are casted from the hard to hit light source, and when they hit a surface, they will store that information in a photon map. When the path tracer then hits a photon, it will use the photon map to estimate how strong that area is affected by light. So with Octane, you have better chances of getting caustics, and you also have dispersion integrated into the shader right out of the box. In Cycles, you would have to build a dispersion shader yourself. You can check out my shader notes tutorial to learn how to do that. To get caustics in Cycles, you would need an impractical amount of samples, while also having to specifically adjust some settings. And in the end, they will probably look worse than in Octane. Octane also has more reflectance models that alter how roughness gets interpreted. The different models in Cycles don't feel as different to each other as the ones in Octane. You can especially see the differences when bumping the roughness up to 1. Some distribution models lose a lot of brightness at high roughness levels. I really like the default Octane model, as it gives rough reflections a kinda silky and smooth look. When creating more complex shader setups, I feel like they are harder to create than in Cycles, especially because Octane is stricter about matching in and outputs. But this could also be due to me having more experience with Cycles. Octane does have more procedural textures, which are pretty useful, like the procedural scratches texture. Actually, all of those procedural textures are pretty cool and fun to play around with. They even have Haarslag. How can Blender as a Dutch foundation not integrate that by default? Also, the procedural sky texture is super interesting, as the sun has settings for the day, month, time zone and geographical location. And with the post-processing effects, you can make the sun look even cooler. Or hotter? But yes, Octane has built-in post-processing effects like lens flares, bloom and color correction. These effects are also achievable using Blender's Compositor, which works with both render engines but uses a completely different UI. If you're interested in compositing effects, you can check out my free compositing pack for Blender. There is a huge upcoming update for it that includes effects like glitches, stylizations, CRT and more. You can already download the beta of the update on Gumroad and test the features with Blender's 4.5 beta. I will properly release the update once Blender's 4.5 stable version comes out. My personal highlight of Octane is the amount of camera settings. You can choose between different camera models that give you different settings. For example, this model gives you a list of presets of some realistic looking lens settings. Depending on the model, you also get a built-in slider for chromatic aberration. My favorite part is the control of depth of field you get. You have so much more artistic control over it than in cycles. And changing the depth of field settings won't give any noticeable differences in render times. You can also get custom bokeh in Blender by putting a plane with a lens texture in front of the camera, but it usually ends up in darkening the image or increases the render time a lot. I recently saw a demo of custom Blender depth of field by using Open Shader language, which is supposed to become a part of Blender in a future update. Also, Octane supports deep rendering, which is essential for advanced VFX compositing. The concept of it is that you get the 3D location of each pixel of your render, so that you can later position elements in the image as if they were part of the 3D scene. Cycles doesn't support that yet, but there currently also is no free software that allows deep compositing, so I will let it slide. Some professionals who want to switch to Blender might find it super helpful to have deep rendering in Blender by using Octane. When comparing render engines, not only the amount of features count. Many people measure a render engine's quality by its speed and the look of the renders it produces. So I prepared both an interior scene and a car scene to compare both render engines with. However, there are a lot of aspects that influence the outcomes, so I will want to address some of the limitations I was facing first. Each render engine has a lot of complex settings you can customize, and it's almost impossible to know how each input value gets translated internally. And this not only applies to the render settings, but also to the materials and lights of a scene. So small differences between lighting and materials are to be expected. Then there also are different color space workflows and tone mapping solutions. What some people don't understand is that a lot of the color management isn't baked into the render data itself. A big part of color management just consists out of making the linear color data from the render engine display properly on a screen. This is called view transform, and in Blender you can find it and its settings in the color management panel. What's important here is that this view transform will only be visible in your exported image when you export it as a format like PNG or JPEG. If you export your render as an OpenEXR file, you will get the render data without the view transform being applied. A lot of people don't seem to know or understand this, because I often saw people talk about colors a render engine produces, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because it doesn't matter when working with EXR files. So to focus on the real differences, I tried my best keeping the colors consistent between both render engines. Alright, let's start with the interior scene. Interiors are quite complex since they often have tricky lighting scenarios. In this scene particularly, I have used multiple IES texture lamps and a HDRI that cast light into the scene through a window to get some interesting shadows. So quite a complex lighting scenario. We also have lots of different materials in the scene: wood, glass, metal, fabric, and volume absorption in the wine bottle and its liquid inside. I converted all materials in the scene by hand and made sure all the textures are being delivered in the same color space across both render engines. I chose the path tracing kernel in Octane for this scene as it is the closest to cycles. For the first comparison, I've rendered the scene from an angle where you have a good overview of its contents. Let's see if you can spot which render engine produced each image. Both images used the same amount of bounces and were set to meet a similar noise threshold within 32K samples. Is there one you clearly prefer? Okay, it's time for the reveal. The first image was rendered using cycles and the second image was rendered using Octane. Both engines weren't able to meet the noise threshold for the entire image within the 32K samples, but cycles was about 4 minutes faster than Octane. The results are quite similar, but the biggest overall difference I've noticed is how the reflections on the wooden flooring, the walls and the glass table looked more natural in Octane. I've made both engines use the same roughness distribution models, so I assumed that Octane Shader has an advanced way of integrating the viewing angle into the roughness. I've created some animations to verify that, but the difference came out to be very subtle or unnoticeable. Let's look at the details. I've rendered multiple angles of the scene with the default settings of each engine to measure the out-of-the-box experience. Then I've also translated the default settings between both engines. So I've put Cycles default settings into Octane and Octane's default settings into Cycles. I did this to balance one engine purely benefiting of having better default settings for the scene. Since Octane has more features than Cycles, it is still facing a disadvantage here, since I tried matching both scenes with each other, which held Octane back from profiting of its exclusive features. So in order to balance that out, I've also rendered all angles with Octane while making use of features like more complex depth of field, vignetting, Octane's own roughness model, AI light, coherent ratio, and more. But I still kept the samples at the default 500. In this angle, we get a close-up to review the fabric materials. Cycles default settings were better for the scene, as Octane settings produced a lot of fireflies in both engines due to not really clamping global illumination. The displacement map of the blanket caused some normal issues in Cycles, which led to the shadows on it looking jagged. Cycles using Octane settings got the fastest render times by finishing the job in under a minute. Octane using Cycles settings produced the best looking result, but also took 22 minutes to finish. The fabrics look softer and less stiff than in Cycles, and Octane was also better at handling the transmission map of the blanket, as you slightly get a few colors from the object beneath it. Octane really suffered from the adaptive sampling settings of Cycles, as it didn't really got a performance benefit from it, and also almost immediately stopped rendering some parts of the image, which led to those black square artifacts. The best balance of performance and looks goes to Octane with its exclusive features turned on. Only thing it's missing are maybe twice or quadruple the amount of samples. Here's an overview of the results. Now a close-up of some glass materials. Cycles with Octane's default settings again finished the render in under a minute, and I have to say, for this amount of time you get a pretty good looking result. It would just need some more light clamping to get rid of the fireflies. On Cycles, I was using my custom advanced glass shader for the wine glass and bottle, which also has a fake dispersion effect. So I also enabled it in Octane, which sadly increased the level of noise a lot. The default settings of Cycles produced artifacts again from having an insufficient amount of bounces. So actually Octane had the better out-of-the-box experience at this time. The wine bottle also looks the most natural there, but it also has its own unique appeal in Cycles and in the Octane render, which used Octane's custom roughness model. But it seems like Cycles is the most efficient at reducing noise. Here is an overview of all the results again. I also rendered the angle from the beginning with all of those settings, and the results regarding speed and look turned out very similar to the other angles again. The overall difference is subtle, but the longer you look at the images, you will find more things that make Octane's result look better. Question is if that subtle difference is worth the extra render time. And Cycles' result isn't bad at all, but Octane just produced more natural looking renders. I also noticed that Octane does a better job at keeping sharp edges, which complements the shape of objects and also helps at separating objects from each other. The glass luster on the ceiling turned out to look better in Cycles when looking at it isolated, while in Octane it kinda did a better job at blending into the scene. I think both results have their own appeals. Let's take a look at how both render engines perform when rendering a car to see how they handle a lot of reflections. Also, the scene has no extra lamp and is only lit by a HDRI and the lights of the car itself. Again, I rendered with both engines at their default settings. I've also bumped up Cycles bounces to match Octane's, so they would produce a result of more similar quality. Both engines were really fast, but Octane was over 10 seconds faster. But Cycles was able to process over 4000 samples in this short amount of time by using adaptive sampling. Honestly, both renders look so similar that they could just be the same image. Only thing I've noticed is the depth of field in Octane has a more pleasant fall-off. There is no clear winner here, but I think I would choose Octane because the image looks slightly better. Cycles doesn't really have many render settings you can configure to influence the speed of the render. Octane on the other hand has a lot of settings you can make. so I've adjusted Octane accordingly and chose its custom roughness model for all materials again. I was still using the default 500 samples of Octane, but managed to save over 10 seconds of render time nonetheless. Octane's distribution model is building up more roughness at low values in comparison to other models. I think it looks neither worse nor better than the model that was used in the previous renders, it just looks different. For the final round, I decided to use open image denoising in both engines and setting both to 32 samples. Honestly, you don't really lose a big amount of quality for the time you are saving. Like, Octane was able to finish the render in 6 seconds and cycles only took 2 seconds, which is kinda insane. The only difference I noticed here was that the bump map on the tire remained a lot sharper in cycles. I initially thought the denoiser just didn't do a good job in Octane there, but when I compared the noisy image passes, I could see that Octane wasn't able to make out the details with the given amount of samples. I think the main takeaway from all the results we've seen and the things I learned during adjusting the scenes is that Octane has more potential, but also requires to spend time on learning the different render settings you can configure and what values work for them. Of course, you can also get good looking results with cycles, and enough people have already proven that. The key difference between both engines is that you would need a lot more knowledge about shaders and color signs to get equally good looking results in cycles. Octane, on the other hand, requires more knowledge about the engine and its settings. Yet I think Cycles is more beginner friendly because of the better integration and the quicker rendering in the viewport, and because of stuff like lamps being invisible to the camera by default. I feel like, especially the different render kernels in Octane can cause a lot of confusion. Also, Cycles feels more stable than Octane, which is probably also because it is better integrated into Blender. Like when I've added a gradient map node in Octane, the whole interface became laggy and went back to normal once I removed it. I was especially annoyed about correctly configuring color spaces, since the default configuration didn't work for me at all. In the end, I just loaded Blender's OCIO config file into Octane and configured it accordingly. I think you should try Octane when you already feel comfortable in Blender and understand the basics. The better you already understand Blender and 3D in general, the more you will profit from Octane, in my opinion. The quick viewport rendering of Cycles is what still stops me from using Octane everywhere. Cycles is just quicker at delivering a useful preview, which you benefit a lot from when trying to get the colors or textures of your object right. Making small adjustments to your materials just doesn't feel as easy and quick in Octane. And some shaders are harder to get, especially since a lot of Octane's values don't come with a slider and require you to insert an input first. Keeping the Octane fork of Blender updated also feels a bit exhausting, but maybe the planned add-on edition will fix that. I think the main takeaway is Octane requires more time to configure and set up, but then delivers better results out of the box than Cycles. Cycles feels a bit more straightforward there, as it doesn't have too many complex settings to begin with, and the learning curve feels more linear than in Octane. Definitely try Octane for Blender and see if you are able to handle the UI. It is definitely worth it. I currently use both render engines and I think this is the way to go. Don't limit yourself to using only one product. Pick the product that's best for what you're currently doing. Octane is especially useful if you want to add some additional eye candy to your scene with detailed depth of field and glass dispersion. I hope I was able to present you this topic in a way that it wasn't boring. It really took a lot of time and effort to gather the data and turn them into an appealing video. Make sure to submarine to my channel to not miss any future videos. See ya!